Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. A warm welcome to this UNDP event, which is being held on the margins of the 76th UN General Assembly. My name is Raymond Gilpin, and I head the Strategy Analysis and Research Team at UNDP's Africa Bureau in New York. The theme for this event is regulation as a stimulus. In this COVID-19 era, we are accustomed to discussing the efficacy of different types of stimuli. However, most often we're talking about financial stimulus. Today we are tabling a different proposition. What if the stimulus comes in the form of regulatory reform? What impact will this have on development effectiveness of regional trade? How could this advance the aspirations of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area arrangement? What are the implications for jobs, for economic growth, and for accelerating the attainment of the SDGs? Partnering with Africa Investor and with the support from the AfCFTA Secretariat, UNDP's Africa Bureau has assembled world-class leaders, thinkers, and doers who would help us unpack this potentially transformative concept. We have a very, very rich agenda today, and we look forward to learning from so many excellent speakers and also getting feedback from you. So before I turn it over to the first speaker, I'd like to just highlight a couple of logistical notes. First, we are providing interpretation in French and English. And so I invite you to go to the bottom of your screen. You will see a globe icon. Please click it and select your language, because our speakers will be making their interventions in both French and English. So select your language so you could be able to receive the remarks in your preferred language of choice. Secondly, we'd love to hear from you. Please use the chat box to share your thoughts, ask questions, provide comments and recommendations, and even share relevant publications and links. And so with the logistical notes made, it gives me great pleasure to invite UN Assistant Secretary General, UNDP Assistant Administrator, and Director of UNDP's Africa Bureau, Ms. Ahuna Ezeakonwa, to deliver some opening remarks. Ms. Ezeakonwa is a passionate Afro-optimist and the architect of the Promised Lands approach to transformative development across the continent. In 2019, she established the Africa Influencers for Development, which is a powerful coalition of leaders in business, academia, and the arts to help steer our thinking as we reconsider Africa's agenda in a post-COVID dispensation. She also pioneered the Africa Young Women's Leadership Forum, and prior to taking up her current position in New York, she led UN teams in the field as resident coordinator in Ethiopia, Uganda, and Lesotho. Ms. Ezeakonwa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Raymond, for moderating this event. Your Excellency Mahamadou Issoufou, the African Union champion of the AfCFTA and former President of the Republic of Niger. Your Excellency Wamkele Mene, SG of the AfCFTA Secretariat, and our co-collaborator, the Executive Secretary, Southern Africa Customs Union, Madam Pauline Mbala Elago, my co-host today, and one of the initiators of this idea, Chairman of Africa Investor, Mr. Hubert Danso, the Secretary General, World Customs Organization, Dr. Kunio Mikuriya, Dr. Admassu Tadesse, President, Trade and Development Bank, and a member of the Africa Influencers for Development. Mr. Kebo Gena, the Executive Director, Pan-African Chamber of Commerce, the Chief Executive Officer, FCI, Mr. Peter Mulroy, distinguished delegates to the 76th United Nations General Assembly, ladies and gentlemen, warm welcome. UNDP is really proud to join Africa Investor and the AfCFTA Secretariat in convening this very important UNGA side event. As world leaders gather in New York for this 76th GA, a critical question on the mind of many is, how can Africa meet the cost for the recovery? That's recovery from COVID-19. Last week, UNDP convened our signature side event on vaccine equity, a shot for all. There, we debated with world leaders, with heads of multilateral and financial institutions, with artists in the creatives, the responsiveness of multilateral financing institutions to finance vaccines. Today, we look inward and we ask, what can Africa do itself? What is within this range of possibilities? How can African leaders take actions that not only contribute to recovery, but also lay the ground for a faster pace of socioeconomic development, that all-important agenda of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals? The answer, we argue today, is in, or at least one of the answers, is in regulation as a stimulus for trade facilitation. We come to this conclusion thanks to groundbreaking research conducted by UNDP and Africa Investor in close collaboration with Coriolis Technologies, one of the leading data-driven global research institutes. We have identified the typologies of regulatory bottlenecks Africa's businesses face in navigating export-import trade, valorized them, and costed the gains to be made if leaders take on a commitment to, in the next few months, remove bureaucratic bottlenecks preventing Pan-African trade. It's quite amazing that a lot of the solutions are within our reach, that there are things that are not insurmountable, and they boil down to action and swift action to remove some of these bureaucratic bottlenecks that continue to stand in the way of the One Africa market. The results are eye-opening when we look at this report. Regulation as a stimulus, what we now popularly call RaaS, is an emerging development model that offers an alternative way for African countries to rise from the ashes of this COVID-19 pandemic. Its goal is to create innovative and actionable ways of advancing attainment of development benefits of the AfCFTA through addressing well-known barriers to trade facilitation, through regulatory reform and policy to reduce customs and pre-border costs, to facilitate access to finance, to improve the business environment, to develop infrastructures, and remove prohibitive trading charges. Put simply, with regulation as a stimulus, we are saying there is a tool in our hands that can stop the economic regression COVID-19 is spreading in its tracks. If leaders commit to regulatory reform for a conducive One Africa market. When you think about it, Excellencies, regulations and how they are implemented is very much a matter of national jurisdiction. Therefore, It is well within the realm of leaders to take decisive action to create this enabling environment that will promote and accelerate socioeconomic transformation through maximizing this One Africa market. And at UNDP, we believe that the AfCFTA can really lift Africa out of the vicious circle of underdevelopment by increasing the value Africa captures in global value chains, by producing made in Africa products, and by fostering structural transformation of Africa. The World Bank and our sister agency, UNECA, have all spoken of the transformative power and the development potential of this CFTA. UNDP believes that the CFTA is sound development policy. It is potent decade of action strategy, and it is a smart, inclusive growth pathway. But we also know that success will not be determined by a story of reduced tariffs alone. The litmus test of whether the AfCFTA lifts millions of people out of poverty is grounded on whether Africans can produce competitively. So determinants of competitiveness on their part are about the regulatory environment. So as we launch this new model, I want to invite all of you to reimagine the possibilities, the promise of how regulatory environments can stimulate Africa out of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we're deliberately using this psychological tipping point of COVID-19 to push this agenda. It is now my pleasure to yield the floor to my co-host, Mr. Hubert Dansel, Chairman of Africa Investor, for his own opening remarks. Over to you, Hubert. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ahuna, greatly appreciated. Your Excellency, Mahamadou Issoufou, former President of the Republic of Niger and African Union Champion of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Your Excellency, my co-host, Madam Ahuna Izia Konwa, Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations Development Programme for Africa. Your Excellency, Wamkele Mene, Secretary General of the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat. The Executive Secretary of the Southern African Customs Union, Madam Pauline Mbala Elago. The Secretary General of the World Customs Organization, Dr. Kunio Mikuriya. Mr. Admassu Tadesse, the President of the Trade and Development Bank, TDB, Mr. Kibor Kena, who is the Executive Director of the Pan-African Chamber of Commerce, the Chief Executive Officer of FCI, Mr. Peter Mulroy, distinguished delegates to the 76th United Nations General Assembly, ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome from Africa Investor. My thanks, first of all, to the United Nations Development Programme, UNDP, and the Secretariat of the African Continental Free Trade Area for partnering with Africa Investor on this new initiative that aims at bolstering the African Continental Free Trade Area towards inclusive recovery from the pandemic. As we all know, the public discourse around the African Continental Free Trade Area has evolved. Whilst its great potential, if only intuitively, has always been perceived, the ambition it holds for structural transformation of the continent's economy was always tempered with, well, really tempered with what we felt was a very enormous challenge, potentially bigger than us. But as minds entertained the generational vision, as the complex negotiations it entailed progressed, and as hard data was being generated on the actual impact it could have, and the discourse around the African Continental Free Trade Area slowly became less of an Everest to be climbed and more that of an El Dorado within reach. Even the COVID-19 pandemic and its unprecedented impact on socioeconomic conditions on the continent were not enough to weaken the positive sentiment that has been fostered and championed by our leaders over time. As a matter of fact, there was not only a growing number of interests surrounded by all stakeholders in this context, but the number of ratifications that were deposited to the African Union during the pandemic increased. But there's also an increasing consensus that the African Continental Free Trade Area, as we've already heard just now, could indeed be the solution to Africa's economic recovery and global trade competitiveness. The initiative we are announcing today, distinguished audience gathered here, is firmly footed in that notion. Regulation as a stimulus, or RaaS, is an instrument according to which strategically facilitating intra-African trade can have a substantial impact on the African economy and can thereby be valorized and leveraged in lieu of monetary stimulus governments have understandably struggled to implement or sustain to date. RaaS is data-driven and grounded in research and builds on the findings of authoritative institutions in Africa and beyond, be it the African Development Bank, UNECA, UNCTAD, ourselves, Africa Investor, the World Bank, or Brookings institutions. Those have shown the positive impact of the African Continental Free Trade Area on the continent and emphasized in broad strokes a critical aspect in this process. Tariff reductions count, but trade facilitation counts even more, and that's what's required to make this a reality. The research program underpinning RaaS goes one step further. It breaks down trade facilitation measures, assesses their costs, and estimates their benefits, not only in terms of money saved by economic actors, essentially our stimulus, but also in terms of increased businesses' revenues and increased trade. RaaS shows very clearly what should be done for women to be major beneficiaries of the African Continental Free Trade Area and to ensure inclusiveness along the tariff liberalization process. Moreover, RaaS allows for trade facilitation to become a strategic endeavor to plan for priorities and sequence for implementation. RaaS is additive. RaaS is measurable. Our conservative estimates show that RaaS's impact on key metrics are potentially better than those offered in other forecasting exercises to date. Two salient examples: with RaaS, efficiencies created at the border could enhance businesses' revenue by 500 billion. That alone is 25% more than the World Bank's estimates. Secondly, most optimistic estimates consider that intra-African trade will grow, an impressively 5.7 billion to 8.7 billion in the long run, thanks to the African Continental Free Trade Area. However, the implementation of RaaS, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, intra-African trade could be uplifted by $7.2 billion each year over the next 5 years. Nicely said, very inspirational. However, it comes with three important caveats that must be considered to unlock RaaS's transformational impact. Firstly, that strategic investment in enabling areas will be critical, and therefore innovative partnerships with the private sector and the infrastructure investment and the trade finance community are essential. Secondly, technology, and especially digital technology, are crucial requisites. And third and finally, maybe more than ever, continued and heightened political will and decisive accelerated pathways for the implementation from our heads of state will be the condition sine qua non for RaaS agenda to bear its full fruits. Distinguished guests, we're extremely fortunate to have today representatives from the public and the private sectors at the highest levels, and ought therefore to have an extraordinary conversation around today's launch of the RaaS initiative. I call on all leaders from all sectors and all stakeholder groups, both large and small, to adopt and champion RaaS, regulation as a stimulus agenda, and build together a coalition to leverage trade facilitation for Africa's inclusive recovery from COVID-19, and as trade resilience and protection from future pandemics. In conclusion, allow me to thank the UNDP, the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat, and high dignitaries present at this 76th United Nations General Assembly. I'm thanking you principally for joining hands with us today and embracing RaaS as the cornerstone of Africa's and potentially the world's trade-driven post-pandemic economic recovery. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hubert Danso, for those framing remarks. And I'd like to remind you that if you haven't selected your language for interpretation, please do so, because the next speaker will be speaking in French, as for all the English speakers. We are now honored and privileged to have a goodwill message from His Excellency, Mahamadou Issoufou, who currently serves as an African champion for the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Arrangement. His Excellency hails from Niger, where he has served in various leadership capacities, including being President of the National Assembly, Prime Minister, and most recently as President of the Republic of Niger from April 2011 to April 2021. We're honored to have you here with us, Your Excellency, and you have the floor.
Bien, merci. Mesdames et messieurs, permettez-moi de saluer mon frère et ami, Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo, dont le pays abrite le secrétariat de la zone de libre-échange continentale africaine, et de remercier tous les chefs d'État et de gouvernement de l'Union africaine pour m'avoir renouvelé leur confiance dans le rôle de champion de la zone de libre-échange continentale africaine. Permettez-moi aussi de remercier le programme des Nations Unies pour le développement PNUD et Africa Investor, ainsi que le secrétariat de la zone de libre-échange continentale africaine, de m'avoir invité à participer à cet événement parallèle de haut niveau. La COVID-19 a plongé le monde dans une crise sans précédent. Depuis la crise de 1929 et les deux guerres mondiales, la croissance et le développement de l'Afrique étaient promoteurs en début de l'année 2020. La croissance devrait passer de 2,9% en 2019 à 3,2% en 2020 et 3,5% en 2021. Des progrès non négligeables étaient enregistrés dans la réduction de la pauvreté et au niveau des indicateurs de la santé. La COVID-19, malheureusement, a brisé cet élan. En effet, nous vivons aujourd'hui la première récession économique à l'échelle du continent depuis une génération. Le PIB de l'Afrique s'est contracté de 3,4% et près de 30 millions de personnes ont été replongées dans la pauvreté. La pandémie de la COVID-19 a eu des effets négatifs sur la sécurité alimentaire, sur la chute des prix des matières premières, accentuant la détérioration des termes de l'échange, sur les revenus provenant du secteur du tourisme, la réduction des recettes publiques, des transferts des fonds, notamment sur la diaspora, des flux d'investissements directs étrangers, la dégradation des monnaies et l'inflation, etc. Alors que faire face à une crise de cette ampleur? Existe-t-il des lueurs d'espoir? Existe-t-il des solutions de relance post-Covid pour l'Afrique? Mesdames, Messieurs, la réponse est oui, car fort heureusement, déjà avant la pandémie, l'Afrique a conçu l'agenda 2063, celui de l'Afrique que nous voulons. Toutes les perspectives de relance post-Covid sont contenues dans cet agenda. Il s'agit notamment des projets phares contenus dans le plan décennal 2013-2023 et des projets qui feront l'objet du prochain plan décennal 2023-2033. Nous devons accélérer la conception des uns et la mise en œuvre des autres. Aussi, devrons-nous accélérer la mise en œuvre du protocole sur la libre circulation des personnes et le droit d'établissement, du plan d'action pour le développement industriel accéléré de l'Afrique, du programme de développement des infrastructures en Afrique, du programme détaillé de développement de l'agriculture en Afrique, de la vision minière africaine, du plan d'action pour l'intensification du commerce intra-africain. Mesdames et messieurs, Je demeure convaincu que la zone de libre-échange continentale africaine, ce projet phare de l'agenda 2063, est le catalyseur de la reprise post-Covid. Par conséquent, il nous faut en accélérer la mise en œuvre, surtout que la Covid-19 nous a amenés à reporter le début officiel des échanges du 1er juillet 2020 au 1er janvier 2021. Pour ce faire, nous devons nous attaquer avec détermination aux catégories suivantes de contraintes au commerce intra-africain: faiblesse des capacités de production et faiblesse de la diversification, coûts commerciaux tarifaires et coûts commerciaux non tarifaires, y compris ceux liés à la COVID-19. Nous devons nous mobiliser plus que par le passé pour la mise en œuvre accélérée des protocoles sur les marchandises, les services et le règlement des différends pour accélérer la phase 2 des négociations portant sur les investissements, sur la concurrence, sur la propriété intellectuelle et le commerce électronique, ainsi que la mise en œuvre des autres projets de l'agenda 2063 cités plus haut. C'est cet ensemble, mis en œuvre de manière cohérente, qui permettra de surmonter les contraintes et de stimuler le commerce intra-africain. C'est cela qui doit être au cœur de notre stratégie de relance post-Covid-19. C'est cela que le PNUD et Africa Investor ont compris en portant l'initiative Regulation as a Stimulus, RaaS, soutenue par le secrétariat de la zone de libre-échange continentale africaine et dont nous faisons l'annonce aujourd'hui. Cette initiative donne aux chefs d'État et de gouvernement africains une solution de relance pratique et un outil approprié devant permettre à leurs économies de se remettre de la COVID-19. C'est sûrement le moteur qui permettra d'accélérer la mise en œuvre de la zone de libre-échange continentale africaine et de mobiliser l'audace des dirigeants africains pour promouvoir la facilitation des échanges et de l'intégration régionale. Le modèle Regulation as a Stimulus met l'accent sur les gains dont peuvent bénéficier les exportateurs grâce à une rationalisation des procédures d'exportation, un commerce et des investissements intra-africains florissants et l'augmentation des revenus des gouvernements. C'est une solution gagnant-gagnant pour les gouvernements, les entreprises et la communauté des investisseurs. Mesdames et messieurs, il est du devoir des chefs d'État et de gouvernement de s'assurer que les cadres réglementaires nationaux harmonisés soutiennent et n'étouffent plus le commerce intra-africain, et il est de leur pouvoir de s'assurer de leur mise en œuvre effective. Ceci implique des interventions courageuses appropriées aux frontières, avant les frontières, dans l'environnement des affaires, sur les infrastructures et sur la réglementation des finances. En matière de réforme visant à améliorer la réglementation des entreprises et à renforcer les droits de propriété, l'Afrique est classée parmi les régions les moins performantes. Les exportateurs africains sont confrontés à des défis liés, par exemple, au temps nécessaire pour traverser les frontières. Les progrès ont été lents, notamment en raison des réglementations et des normes incohérentes et contradictoires ou aux barrages routiers. Les gouvernements doivent donc faciliter le commerce transfrontalier en investissant dans les infrastructures physiques, en simplifiant les formalités douanières, en harmonisant les normes, en rationalisant les procédures de licence et les exigences en matière de certificat d'origine, etc. Les gouvernements doivent mettre en place des politiques intelligentes de facilitation des échanges. Guichet unique, poste-frontière à guichet unique, dédouanement avant l'arrivée, système de suivi de cargaison, etc., afin de s'attaquer aux barrières non tarifaires. Toutes ces mesures permettent de réaliser des gains. Et c'est ça le concept Regulation as a Stimulus. les opérateurs économiques réalisent des gains du fait d'un programme de réforme sur les principales contraintes réglementaires. C'est le stimulus dont les économies africaines ont tant besoin. L'ampleur de ce stimulus est substantielle. D'ici 2025, la mise en œuvre du modèle Regulation as Stimulus augmenterait le commerce intra-africain d'au moins 50 milliards de dollars. Tandis que le commerce dans les secteurs où les femmes sont les plus représentées connaîtra un saut de 18%. Le modèle Régulation as Stimulus qui met l'accent sur les gains dont peuvent bénéficier les exportateurs grâce à une rationalisation des procédures d'exportation, un commerce et des investissements intra-africains florissants et l'augmentation des revenus du gouvernement. C'est une solution gagnant-gagnant pour le gouvernement, les entreprises et la communauté des investisseurs. Aussi, en appelais-je aujourd'hui à tous les dirigeants des secteurs publics et privés à rallier l'initiative Regulation as Stimulus pour stimuler la reprise économique de l'Afrique après la pandémie de la COVID-19. J'appelle les chefs d'État et de gouvernement africains à adopter et à exploiter la plateforme Regulation as Stimulus en s'engageant à améliorer rapidement les environnements réglementaires de leur pays, afin que nous donnions aux Africains une chance de récolter la prospérité inhérente à l'Afrique que nous voulons. Toutes les études montrent que la zone de libre-échange continentale africaine est porteuse de développement, de croissance économique et de bien-être social, non seulement pour les Africains, mais également pour le reste du monde. Pour terminer, mesdames et messieurs, permettez-moi de remercier à nouveau le PNUD, Africa Investor et le secrétariat de la ZLECAF, ainsi que les participants au présent événement qui se tient en marge de cette 76e Assemblée générale des Nations unies, de s'être réunis autour d'une cause aussi louable. Tous ensemble, faisons de l'établissement d'un cadre régulatoire propice au développement du commerce au sein du continent la stratégie de relance de l'Afrique post-Covid-19. Je dis vive l'intégration africaine, que Dieu bénisse l'Afrique. Je vous remercie, mesdames et messieurs.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for those very thoughtful and thought-provoking remarks. Indeed, you have talked about the importance of trade, not just as a gateway, but also as a pathway to sustainable development across the continent. And in your view, regulation as stimulus operates not just at the national level, but also at the household level. And we thank you for challenging us to think through the possibilities and the potential for this change that we all would like to see through more regional cooperation and collaboration. We thank you so much, Your Excellency, for those very sage comments. Next, we're going to hear from the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat. Unfortunately, Secretary General Wamkele Mene is unable to join us, but he will be ably deputized by Commissioner Silva Ojako, who is Chief of Staff and Senior Director at the Secretariat. Commissioner, you have the floor.
All right, thank you very much, Gelpin. Your Excellency Mahamadou Issoufou, African Union champion and leader of the AfCFTA, former President of the Republic of Niger. Excellency Madam Ahuna Eziakonwa, Assistant Secretary General of the UNDP Africa Regional Bureau. Excellency Madam Pauline Mbala Elago, Executive Secretary of SACU. Dr. Kunio Mikuriya, the Secretary General of the World Customs Organization. Hubert Danso, the chairman of Africa Investor, Mr. Admassu Tadesse, President, Trade and Development Bank, Mr. Kebu Gena, Executive Director, Pan-African Chamber of Commerce, Mr. Peter Mulroy, CEO of International Factoring Association, the distinguished delegates to the 76th UN General Assembly, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to deliver apologies from His Excellency Wamkele Mene, Secretary General of the AfCFTA. He would very much have liked to attend this meeting and deliver his remarks, but he had to go for another meeting, virtual meeting with the President of South Africa and the chairperson of the Council of Ministers regarding issues to do with the AfCFTA implementation. And so it is upon me to say it is a great pleasure for us at the AfCFTA Secretariat to join you on the margins of the 76th UN General Assembly as we converge to talk about how trade and intra-Africa trade in particular can lift Africa out of the setback occasioned by the COVID-19 pandemic. For us, the AfCFTA, the agreement is a stimulus package in itself, as we have always said. And today we witness the unfolding of some of the groundbreaking research that confirms this reality. And we launch a new initiative that positions us well to bring this promise from the treaty into the hands of the business operators across Africa and indeed globally. We have always maintained that the AfCFTA is meant to improve intra-Africa trade, but also trade between the African continent and the rest of the world. And this, the human face of the AfCFTA, is what drives us. The interface between the AfCFTA and the business operators is what drives us at the Secretariat. Excellencies, before us is an opportunity to change the destiny of Africa, to change the destiny of the women and the men, and the SME and the big corporations by offering a new pathway to making trade easier, more streamlined, and less costly in the continent. We are in a position in the AfCFTA, we are in a position, excellencies and gentlemen, to lift millions of people out of poverty as we turn a new page on intra-African trade in the value-added products as we move up the value chain. This movement up the value chain will improve not only intra-Africa trade, but also improve trade between us and the rest of the world, as we have said. When we successfully implement the AfCFTA, it is estimated we will be lifting nearly 100 million people out of poverty. The AfCFTA opens opportunities for us to industrialize our economies, to produce value-added products rich in an African content. And in this regard, we have started the mapping for the development of regional value chains, including agro-processing, the pharma sector, as well as the automotive sector. And these are discussions which are now going on among us, between us and the various regional economic communities, but also with the member states. Now, the tariff reduction component in the AfCFTA is important, but as we all know, it only corrects the historical wrongs about a trade policy that was designed to keep away African nations from trading among us themselves, but only trading with the rest of the world. However, it will not solve all our problems of trade. Tariffs are not the only issue when it comes to trade. things that we are discussing now, the challenges of trade facilitation, are critical and they underpin the competitiveness. Trade facilitation, along with measures such as the standards harmonization and so on, are the issues that underpin the efficiency with which trade and indeed industrialization can take place. Now, the application of regulations on the ground, the FCA state parties will be the final determinant of whether intra-Africa trade takes place as we have promised, and that it will take place on a preferential basis. The benefits derived from the implementation of the AfCFTA will also stem very much from the efficiencies that will be created from a supportive trade facilitation regime. And so without the supportive measures to implement trade facilitation reforms, we will struggle to implement the AfCFTA. And therefore, it's important at this point that to note that in the AfCFTA, we have the provisions on customs, transit, trade facilitation to ease the compliance with import and export procedures for African businesses, but also for other business operators from the rest of the world. Now, the provisions are to be implemented through a harmonized continental system, and we've started a discussion towards this with the implementation at the national level. Now, at the moment, one of the key priorities for the Secretariat in terms of the implementation of the AfCFTA is the customs, the transit, and the trade facilitation. And we've started the studies to look at the trade corridors in order to ensure that the regulation, the trade facilitation along the transport corridors is friendly to the implementation of the AfCFTA. This program, which aims to leverage the strategic trade facilitation reforms to make exports less costly, thereby providing the savings to economic operators, is what will act as a stimulus for Africa, as a stimulus to business, as a stimulus for investment in the continent. At a time when other nations issue stimulus packages to citizens to counter the pandemic socioeconomic impact, for us at the Secretariat, we are swayed by the argument that Africa can do much more than that by streamlining the regulations to facilitate and not penalize trade, in implementing the trade facilitation measures. So as I said, we've started identifying the costs associated with existing regulatory bottlenecks and adopt a set of multidimensional interventions whose fruits can be harvested directly by the business operators. Excellencies, the UNDP and African investor colleagues have updated on the transformational impacts that this regulation will bring by tackling the most crippling bottlenecks in finance, infrastructure, and those that African traders must face before the border to border and after the border and in the business environment. The benefits are substantial, as has been highlighted by the Africa investor colleague. We are therefore pleased to endorse the regulations as a stimulus model, for it takes us steps further in attaining those enabling environments we need for AfCFTA to thrive, and back on the course of working towards the ideals of Agenda 2063 and the SDGs. In conclusion, I wish to thank the UNDP and the Africa investor for this timely initiative, for which we as the AfCFTA Secretariat are associated with as we launch it in order for us to work for the implementation of the AfCFTA. I thank you very much for your kind attention. Over to you, sir.
Thank you so much, Commissioner, for those excellent remarks, framing the Secretariat's view, not just of regional trade in general, but of the regulation as stimulus approach in particular. Unfortunately, His Excellency Mahamadou Issoufou has to leave us because of prior demands on his time, but he has kindly asked Waifan Ibrahim, Vice Executive Secretary of the Mahamadou Issoufou Foundation, to replace him. We thank you once more, Your Excellency, for being with us here today. Next on the agenda is probably gets to the core of why we are here. It's going to be a technical presentation of the regulation as a stimulus concept and model by Dr. Joy Kategekwa, who is strategy advisor in UNDP's Visional Bureau for Africa. Dr. Kategekwa is a leading global expert on international trade and development, and over the last 18 years, she has been advising countries on how to shape trade-led growth strategies. She is also the founding head of the UNCTAD Regional Office in Africa, where she spent close to 5 years and led UNCTAD's advisory teams that supported the design of the AfCFTA. We are very honored and pleased to have her to lead us through the concept, the model, and also the possibilities. Dr. Kategekwa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Raymond Gilpin. Good morning again from New York. Distinguished Excellencies, my boss, the Assistant Secretary General here at UNDP Africa, it is a pleasure to make a contribution to this conversation. Let me start by acknowledging the role of Coriolis Technologies, which has helped us, i.e. UNDP and Africa Investor, to conceptualize, to data dig, and to understand what indeed the benefits could be. So as you started, Dr. Raymond, what if the solution were within reach? What if the solution were something that is at the discretion of African heads of state? I will take you through the model of regulations as a stimulus. And we will really start by looking at the introduction, then understand what the model is saying, look at the case studies, the transformative solutions proposed, and then the call to action. Just a second. So let us move. Let us start. The context. The development context in which we're operating pushes us to think carefully about what the other solutions could be. When we think about the COVID pandemic and the current situation, we're looking at a situation of regression, where an estimated 30 million people in Africa have been pushed back into poverty, extreme poverty. 799 million people are facing food insecurity. We've seen a drop in the growth projections. And this is something important because, as you recall, pre-COVID, we used to talk about the lions on the move. Now growth projections are only at about 3.4%. A debt crisis with, huge numbers when you think about some of the countries, as you can see there in the slide, domestic price volatility from scarcities and imports fueling inflation, and so on and so forth. All this to say that the economic situation in Africa right now is a situation of regression. And as President Issoufou rightly said, former President Issoufou rightly said, for the first time, Africa is experiencing a first in a generation crisis, the first in 25 years. What this means also for the SDGs is that we've had a general rollback on those much desired and treasured gains that have been made to this point. And so can trade play a role? When we talk about the SDGs, we often say that trade is a means of implementation of the SDGs. And so how is trade anticipated to perform in this dimension? What we're seeing and what concerns us is that the trade is estimated to grow in the next 5 years by only 2.8% if we don't implement RaaS. And what we're saying is that this pace, 2.8, is not fast enough to restore trade to its pre-pandemic levels or to surmount the development challenge that has been occasioned by the pandemic. And so what this means, therefore, is that we need to think differently. Therefore, regulations as a stimulus. So what exactly are we talking about? What is this RaaS, regulations as a stimulus? It is a mechanism. It is a pathway for accelerating intra-African trade. You see, despite facing a depressed fiscal space, limiting the ability to give financial checks, stimulus checks, like countries in the advanced economies, governments, through their strategic role as regulators, hold the key, hold a lever that can be actioned to help African firms to absorb the short-term shocks that are occasioned by open markets. And so through a series of regulatory measures aimed at accelerating intra-African trade facilitation and trade promotion, we're saying that governments can offer and critically offset some of those short-term adjustment costs associated with increased openness. And so effectively, what is at hand here is that as governments introduce those regulations that facilitate trade, they are relieving firms from high exporting costs, and that this is the stimulus because it provides the impetus to push post-pandemic recovery efforts. And so what is RaaS in short? We're talking about a goal to increase intra-African trade as a way to restore the continent to sustainable growth post-COVID-19. We're saying it's possible because regulations only cost political will. They don't cost necessarily the type of financial muscle that we would have talked about if we were saying stimulus checks. And there's already a good dose of political will, as we see, not only with the African Continental Free Trade Area, but also with the push we have seen with the quick number of ratifications. Noteworthy that even during a pandemic, the numbers of ratifications have kept increasing. And so RaaS is really the regulatory levers that can be pulled by heads of state quickly to create a step change in trade facilitation and enable trade and investment to contribute to sustainable development. So what is the model? What did we do to reach this point? Let's talk a little bit about method questions. So the aim of this research that we're unveiling today is that to develop a regulatory reform agenda, regulatory reform program over a period of 18 months. And we're saying that this period of 18 months, if it sees the movement of regulations to facilitate trade through trade facilitation, it will enhance intra-African trade, and it can be championed by heads of state. The specific objectives were that let us identify 5 thematic areas, and we'll get to them in a minute, understand the challenges in these thematic areas, cost the challenges, see the effects, and then talk about what it means in terms of savings. And then once we do that, let's get an implementation plan, ideally for heads of state to take on as a promise, as a commitment for an 18-month period, so that we then start to see the impact on trade, the impact on GDP, the impact on employment, revenues, etc. And it was also very important for us that the methodology we're adopting is adaptable, replicable to similar contexts. For example, similar work that is being done with the International Chamber of Commerce, the Commonwealth, and others. And so again, really just to emphasize the method questions there, let's get into the case studies because this is what is critical. So we identified 5 case studies. What is happening with access to finance? How can businesses, exporters access that fluid, that oil that manages international trade? What about the business environment? What's happening there in terms of the capacity to be enabled? What about infrastructure? What happens before the border and at the border? And then finally, what is happening with prohibitive trade charges? So that is the model. Let's then look at, very briefly, what is happening in these 5 case study areas. So in the business environment, these are the key challenges that were identified, that visa costs are high, and they therefore form a restriction to intra-African trade, especially for SMEs. We also found that fewer women traders know about trading regulations, and this causes a reluctance to formalize their trade. And as they don't formalize their trade, they're more subject to exploitation and even sexual abuse. We also find that a lack of sufficient deliberate policies to support SMEs and women traders is affecting them negatively. And then due to a lack of information, for example, on which goods are available, where in Africa, you find that several goods and services are imported into Africa from outside of the continent, and yet similar goods would have been available on the continent had the information been available. So what are we finding then on the question of before the border? What happens before the border? What we're seeing there is that there are different trade regimes and conflicting industry practices, and these cause confusion to traders. We're also finding that there is no space allowing pre-border electronic payments online. And a lack of digital certifications and documentation also causes delays and costs to traders. Further, we see that it is difficult to access crucial information like the documents needed in licensing, the road fees, the rules regarding regional economic communities. And there's also not one space that provides all the information, or keeps it updated. And so you have sudden changes in some instances, like border closings and so on and so forth, or even bans to export or to import of certain products, which has been exacerbated by the COVID pandemic. So these complex trade regulations really act as a barrier, especially for women and for youth. So what is happening at the border when you reach the border? Here we're finding that different countries have different regulations, which makes border crossing somewhat complex, costly, and slower. We also find that making payments is complicated as countries use different currencies and traders can't prepay or pay electronically. The implementation of regulations and procedures also varies across border officials. And then also we see that there's not enough of sampling, there's not enough of pre-shipment inspection. They're taking samples, for example, of too many products. And this of course causes slowness for traders. Then there's also the issue of using out-of-date systems and paper documentation, which causes delays and makes it impossible to track and report real-time trade and statistics. So we've seen what happens before the border. We've seen what happens at the border. What are the points emerging from the infrastructure question? Here we're seeing that infrastructural iniquities really disadvantage women at the border, crossing borders, especially because, there is no particular facilities, infrastructure facilities for women, for example, related to childcare facilities, pedestrian lanes, lighting, sanitation, even lodging. We also find some out-of-date systems and technologies which slow down processes. Safety can be an issue, for example, overloading of these tracks, making it unsafe in some instances. And then there are issues also with connectivity. As a parenthesis, it's important to note that in a parallel process that UNDP, UN Women, and the AfCFTA Secretariat is also undertaking concerning the issues affecting women in trade, some of these views are also echoed. So what happens then with the question of finance? What we're seeing here is that the credit analytics are a challenge, that many of the SMEs do not have the sorts of books, formalized books, that can help to ease and quicken cross-border transactions. So they mostly have spreadsheets with accounts, payables, receivables, which require external validation. We also find on finance that there is a lot of rejection of the requests of SMEs to borrow money. It is a trend that's upward. So 40%, for example, in 2019 are rejected. They see them as, risky, so to speak. Women face a particular challenge there. The banks are saying women don't have collateral, they're more risky borrowers. And so therefore you don't have tailor-made services to help this particular type of borrower. Know your consumer is also difficult in a situation of no digital IDs. So these are the 5 areas and the 5 issues emerging. What then do we propose as solutions out of the regulations as a stimulus model? And what are the impacts, most importantly? And here we have a 5+1 analogy. The first point being, the one being that it all sits on political will. Political will is very interesting because what we're observing as well, and the research and the analysis undertook an assessment of up to 1 million words, trying to understand the perception in the media of Africans and how they view both challenges and opportunities. What we find is that there is an increasing focus in the public on the opportunities. There is momentum behind positive change and support for trade facilitation. And so politics typically follows the public discourse. And that is why you find that more and more, even the political leaders on the continent are talking about issues like logistics, infrastructure, digitalization, the need to take into account issues of women, a focus on manufacturing. I think in the COVID pandemic response, you had most African leaders talking about the need for Africa to rethink this risk associated with importing a lot from outside and to industrialize and manufacture on the continent, and also the importance of services. So that is the political will. It is there. We feel we can draw on it. So in digital, what are the solutions that we're proposing? We're proposing the need for structures to enable digitalization. We're proposing single windows, which are those one-stop places where all of the trade-related, export-related rules and procedures and processes can all be anchored in one digital space, standardization, and also legislation to enable digital IDs. What we're finding, if we do this, is that there will be a cost saving and trade gains in digitalizing cross-border infrastructure to the tune of 17 billion per 12,000 shipment. We're also finding that it will create up to 27 billion of additional trade in Africa by 2025, if these reforms are done within an 18-month period as soon as possible. On financing, what we're saying, the solutions are the following. Regulations that widen questions around access to finance, but also regional agreements that deal with cross-border capital flows. We're also looking at national level regulations that deal with issues around charge ceilings, enabling factoring, and making sure digital taxation is possible. What is the impact of this? The simulations are showing us that intra-African trade can increase by 35.8 billion by 2025. If this is when it grows annually by 14%. So we can all see what this regulations as a stimulus model is bringing in terms of resources, financial resources. When we now go back to the question of infrastructure, what we're seeing as solutions are that we need broadly frameworks that support cross-border trade and reduce costs. We need guidelines that promote the cross-border movement of professionals. We need agreements that also enhance internal movement of professionals and beyond professionals. We're looking at regulations to enable digital documentation. We're proposing free visas for work and the broad enhancing of labor mobility. And what we're finding that comes out of implementing such regulations is that you have time and efficiency savings. How? Currently, it takes 128 days to cross a border and travel 100 kilometers with freight. What we're saying is that if you apply regulations as a stimulus, you find that this time could reduce by 80% per the 100-kilometer journey. Obviously, that means savings for businesses as well. And then when we go to the question of enabling environments, we're talking about solutions like freedom of movement on goods and services, single windows, digital documents, regional agreements that support digital documents, and also digital documents at ports and logistics hubs. And in terms of the impact, here is where the biggest is, I think, that by creating more enabling environments, we would add 500 billion to business revenues in Africa by 2025. We would create over 268,000 jobs, and we would, do this by 2025 again. So again, we're seeing what the benefits are. Finally, on inclusion, what we're saying as solutions is that we need to pay particular attention to those excluded groups, women and the informal economy. We need to incentivize for moving from formalization to the formal economy. We need agreements on policies that support these groups, such as social enterprises. We need quotas that allow them to access finance. We need to protect these informal businesses, and we need legislation that requires registration and legal identification to go over that hurdle of knowing your customer, so to speak. And the impact of this is also interesting. We're finding that there will be an 18% uplift in the sectors where women's businesses dominate. These are food, these are soft commodities like cereals, fruits, vegetables, and textiles. We're also seeing overall a 10% uplift in trade because these sectors are big. So we have seen the gains, and I'm drawing to a close shortly. What then is the call to action? Let's remember the big figures and talk about what that means. We're saying that by 2025, regulations as a stimulus could accelerate growth on existing estimates by the following. 1, increasing intra-African trade by 50 billion. 2, increasing trade by 18% in sectors where women are highly involved. 3, reducing business costs by 17.6 billion. 4, adding 500 billion to business revenues. And 5, creating up to 268,000 more jobs. So this, in a sense, is what RaaS is about. But let's bring it back in closing to human development. Why is this important? And human development obviously is a critical issue for us at UNDP, because beyond the direct impact that we've seen on incomes, on trade, on employment, on formalization, on gender, what regulations as a stimulus really does is expand individual capabilities by, for example, enabling cross-border flows of professionals, expanding access to finance for women and youth, creating more jobs, enhancing business revenues, creating inclusive border infrastructures for marginalized groups, reducing barriers to exporting, and enhancing public service delivery through digitalization. Overall, lifting people out of poverty. So RaaS is really about enabling the resilience of African exporters to develop at an individual level, protecting intra-African trade, individuals and communities against future shocks. So that, in a sense, is what we have for you today. And there you'll find some references. But again, just to emphasize really that the call to action is for heads of state, for the community in the practice of trade to think about, embrace this new way of bringing the much needed recovery to the continent. Thank you very much, Dr. Raymond.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kategekwa, for talking us through what this initiative means and what it could mean for Africa's development. I'd like to apologize to everyone. We have overrun a little bit, but do bear with us. We do have a number of very excellent interventions during the discussion period. Continue to share your thoughts and ask your questions in the chat room. We'll try and get a few of those in. But first, let me invite for brief remarks, Dr. Admassu Tadesse, who is President Emeritus and Group Managing Director of the Eastern and Southern African Trade and Development Bank. Dr. Tadesse, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning. I hope you can hear me. Is the sound okay?
You're a little low, but we could hear you.
Very good. My connection isn't as strong as it should be, so I'm going to leave the video out and just intervene if that's fine. Maybe I should just start by thanking UNDP and Africa Investor for this very thoughtful session. Always a pleasure collaborating with you, Ahuna and Hubert. And of course, a lot has been said. I'll just maybe zoom into one or two observations from our TDB experience. I think, first of all, I should say that we at TDB also very much believe that smart regulation, modern regulation is a significant institutional factor in the environment of doing business. We see this as a transactional bank that's very active in corporate finance, SME finance, trade finance. These are all the segments that we serve as a bank. And we have seen over the years how streamlined and efficient regulation can really serve as a stimulus, both in good times and in bad times. We all see these indexes, how countries like Mauritius and Rwanda have been celebrated as investment destinations because they've managed to get the regulations smart. So it's an incentive as well. As a bank, one of the exciting efforts we have been investing in during this COVID time as a way of course, overcoming some of the challenges has been to embrace digitization very aggressively as a means to overcoming some of these shocks and constraints around movements and the like. Of course, this has been a mega trend around the world to enable safe and efficient interaction. And of course, there's been other dimensions that have also become very possible as a result of this. A specific one concerns cutting edge e-commerce methodologies, such as blockchain technology and digital contracting, which we have aggressively undertaken over the several months since COVID hit us all. And we've managed to execute in a very innovative way over $500 million US of inter-African trade using this kind of innovation, which is centered on distributed ledger capabilities, which of course is blockchain. And of course, there's been a number of efficiencies that have been made possible by this. One is, of course, reducing turnaround times and in doing business. In some cases, it's reduced from 3 weeks to several hours because we've leapfrogged the conventional logistics and courier-based methods of exchanging documentation. There's been other benefits as well, such as avoiding errors and ambiguities that come with conventional documentation. So there's been a lot of benefits from embracing digitization, but there have been regulatory challenges. And I think this type of initiative that's being discussed today can make a contribution in speeding up reforms and legal development in some of our countries. For instance, a number of our countries have not yet adopted laws that recognize electronic signatures as being of equal genuineness as wet ink signatures. And as a result, we've not been able to use some of these new cutting edge technologies, such as DocuSign, for signing cross-border transaction documents. So we think that it's important that our African countries take steps and be assisted to adopt laws that recognize the validity of electronic signatures. In these times, of course, of limited mobility, it's also important that our countries adopt laws that allow for remote notarization of documents. In such cases, they wouldn't have to have physical movement of people and teams, but you can have a notary in a particular locality use a video link to verify the identity of a signatory and confirm agreement to contract terms remotely from a distance. But of course, you need to have the enabling legislation in place. There's also need for practical laws that also recognize and allow the electronic transfer of records for the purpose of supporting cross-border trade finance. Such laws would enable us to transfer letters of credit, documentation electronically, whether it's by email or using distributed ledger technology, without having to wait for originals, be couriered back and forth. And as many of us know, in these kinds of disconnected times, it's not so easy to move documents efficiently as we used to. But of course, even as normality comes back, there will be big efficiency gains by maintaining digital methodologies. There are ways and means, of course, to help our African countries to develop their legal codes to be able to embrace such digital ways of doing business. We know that the United Nations Commission on International Law has over the years developed model laws covering e-commerce, e-signature, and electronic transfer of documents. So it's not that hard. I think there's a lot of facilities that are in place, but I think we just need leadership now to really move quickly and implement some of these innovations that allow digital business. And of course, this is all about regulation and governance. And this is why I thought I would just zero in on these particular points, because we've seen how it can be very practically efficient to rapidly move into a digital world. The AfCFTA, of course, envisages us all to do a lot more business across borders, and that will require legal frameworks to be more or less in consonance across countries, so that various actors, whether you're banks or business people, can do efficient business across borders. So yes, I think it's all about regulation. I think something as simple as just transacting in the banking space will need much more rethinking of the types of regulation we have on our books. So I'll leave it at this and thank again the organizers for this topical engagement. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tadesse, for those keen insights from a development banking perspective. Now I'd like to look at what this would look like at a sub-regional level. And we're very honored to have with us Ms. Pauline Mbala Elago, who is the Executive Secretary for the Southern African Customs Union Secretariat. Ms. Elago, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, moderator, and a very good afternoon, at least for us, it's good afternoon to everyone. Let me stand by the protocol that has been established by previous speakers, but acknowledge and thank the Assistant Secretary General of the UNDP Africa Bureau, as well as Mr. Admassu from the Africa Investor for this initiative. Let me also just thank you for inviting us to this important dialogue. We welcome and congratulate UNDP and Africa Investor for convening the stakeholder dialogue today on regulations as a stimulus for bringing Africa out of the COVID-19 pandemic through strategic trade facilitation and promotion. We further wish to express our appreciation to UNDP and Africa Investor for prioritizing AfCFTA agenda through the development of this model, which we believe is quite a game changer in a way. Having listened to the presentation and the details about the model, we trust that the model will play a critical role in accelerating the implementation of the trade facilitation reforms across the continent, and in turn, greatly enhance the effectiveness and implementation of the AfCFTA, in addition to complementing the economic recovery measures being undertaken from the pandemic. The implementation of the AfCFTA, top priority for SACU. We see it as a catalyst for deepening integration and economic development. We also see it as providing an opportunity for the continent to enhance its productive capacity, build robust regional value chains, and fast-track the modernization and reforms needed to enhance the customs and trading environment. So this discussion today is therefore quite timely, as it comes when countries, including those of us in the SACU region, are focused on recovery efforts to rebuild our economies. As you know, Africa has been hit hard by the COVID-19 pandemic. The IMF estimates that economic growth in the continent contracted by 1.8% in 2020. It is now projected that it will record a growth of only 3.4% in 2021, but of course, starting from a low base. Returning to the same or higher pre-COVID growth levels is highly desirable, but clearly challenging, especially in the context where countries are facing rising debt burdens. This calls for a systematic policy and regulatory interventions that are not only aimed at creating a conducive environment for cross-border trade, but more importantly, ensure structural transformation of the economies. And I believe, and having listened to the presentation on this model, that this is an innovative solution and a tool that is therefore timely, as it will contribute to these efforts. I believe tools such as this will greatly enable Africa to create a much more resilient trade environment that is able to withstand any future disruption, but also able to maximize on the benefits presented by the AfCFTA. Therefore, we welcome this important discussion in light of the socioeconomic devastation brought about by the pandemic and the need to set the continent and the region on a path to economic recovery. Director of Proceedings, ladies and gentlemen, having said that, allow me to also just highlight some of the work that we are doing in trade facilitation to streamline regulation in order to maximize the AfCFTA utilization. SACU member states have adopted a refocused work program that prioritizes three main areas, namely industrialization through the development of regional value chains, focusing on mobilization of cross-border investment, export promotion, and also trade facilitation and logistics as a second priority. And thirdly, implementation of the effectiveness of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. This work for us is meant to deliberately position SACU to take full advantage of the opportunities presented by the AfCFTA through increased production capacity in selected priority sectors, and we have highlighted agro-processing, pharmaceutical, as well as textile and clothing as priority sectors, and to mobilize investments in the regional value chains so that we can promote export and also create a seamless environment for cross-border trade. On our trade facilitation program and logistic program specifically is designed to support the regional industrialization agenda as well as facilitate a seamless implementation of the AfCFTA. It focuses on 6 core areas, and that is customs cooperation, behind the border measures, support to trade negotiations and implementation of trade agreement, border coordination, transport and logistics activities, and also cross-cutting policy imperatives. In addition, we are also prioritizing, of course, capacity building and gender mainstreaming. We are developing interventions and practical solutions to address the challenges posed by the changing trade landscape globally, continentally, regionally, and also at the national level. In addition, SACU is implementing an IT connectivity that allows for automatic exchange of information in real time among member states, and also the Authorized Economic Operators Program. Work is underway to develop a regional Authorized Economic Operators Program that will enable mutual recognition of traders in SACU and eventually beyond. Ultimately, our program is aimed at improved administrative efficiency, reduction of time and cost associated with cross-border trade, improve compliance and security of supply chains. And in doing so, we are working closely with the private sector, both in terms of trade facilitation and industrialization. It is also important that we implement and drive a coherent continental trade facilitation agenda. And I believe in doing so, we must seek to remove and address bottlenecks in order to accelerate trade. And we can achieve this by building on the foundation that has been laid through the various regional economic community, but also related to trade facilitation, and complemented obviously by innovative solutions such as RaaS. We believe that this sort of innovation will certainly help spur the efforts that we are working towards in improving the trading environment, but more so really to fast-track implementation of the Continental Free Trade Area. In conclusion, we welcome the opportunity to strengthen cooperation with UNDP on trade facilitations and logistics, particularly applying a tool such as this. Having listened to its content and what it does, I really thought this is something that we can use ourselves in the program that we are designing and implementing in relation to trade facilitation and logistics that is aimed to position ourselves to take full advantage of the Continental Free Trade Area. We ourselves are also ready to share the experiences that we have gained in implementing the various initiatives that we have implemented so far that have certainly yielded some tangible gains, such as in IT connectivity, the Authorized Economic Operators Program, risk management, compliance and enforcement. And these are some of those very same elements that are considered and variables that are considered in this tool. So we welcome the model warmly and congratulate UNDP and Africa Investor for really this innovative solution that again proves that the implementation of the Continental Free Trade Area is a responsibility of all of us, private sector, development partners, regional economic communities, as well as national governments. It's only when we work together to identify practical solutions that will really address those much needed solutions that will enhance and accelerate implementation of the Continental Free Trade Area that we will start seeing the success and the effectiveness of this very important trading arrangement that we have embarked upon at the continent. So let me end here and once again thank UNDP Africa and the Africa Investor Support in collaboration with the AfCFTA Secretariat for convening this very important and timely conversation. And certainly we look forward to unpacking the model and the tool and certainly see how we can apply it to our own programs. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Elago, for giving us that sub-regional perspective from the SACU Secretariat. And now we're going from sub-regional to global. And we've talked a lot about the potential for regulatory reform to be transformative in the African context. Mr. Kunio Mikuriya is the Secretary General of the World Customs Organization. So he has a global purview. And we're looking forward to hearing his perspectives on, first of all, the regulations as a stimulus concept. And second, from a global perspective, are there lessons we could learn from others who've done similar undertakings? Mr. Kunio, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, Excellencies, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. Customs is a revenue collection agency and therefore plays an important role in domestic resource mobilization. However, its performance could have negative impacts on economic operators if it lacks efficiency and becomes undue regulatory burden to business. The WCO suggests a solution to this dilemma by providing best practices from its 183 members around the world. Our proposed measures are based on 4 T's, namely tools, technology, training, and trust. First, we provide tools such as the revised Kyoto Convention that guide customs to simplify procedures and adopt risk management approach to minimize unnecessary intervention. We constantly develop the related tools and standards, such as the framework of standards on cross-border e-commerce, to address the thriving e-commerce under the pandemic situation. The use of WCO global standards will connect the African continent internally and externally. Second, we recommend the use of technology to digitalize the border procedures towards paperless trade, including facilitated e-payment. Customs should be connected to IT system of other government agencies that have regulatory requirements at borders through single window by using the WCO data model to ensure interoperability. The essence of using technology is to get electronic advanced data to apply risk management at an early stage, whereby customs could identify which cargo to inspect before their arrival and let other cargo cleared quickly without unnecessary inspection. Well, in the African context, it is important to think about transit because you have so many landlocked countries, and again, interoperability of IT system between the custom administrations of transit and landlocked country is essential. Third, customs officers should be well trained to master tools and technology to implement these measures. The WCO develops and delivers tailor-made training for Africa as we are focused on human resource development with lifetime training to ensure customs officers keep high standards of professionalism, integrity, and respect for gender equality and diversity. Fourth, customs need to work with economic operators as partner, and this requires trust between them. The WCO recommends to introduce authorized economic operator program, whereby customs identify compliant and trusted business and provide them facilitative measures. We also often recommend the customs, other government agencies, and the business to get together and measure the time necessary for clearance for each step to identify bottlenecks, whether they are infrastructure or data or regulatory problem or finance, and jointly develop an action plan to improve the border performance. I heard that the presentation by the RaaS initiative, and it points exactly to this point. Actually, the WTO agreement on trade facilitation strongly recommends the use of WCO's time release study program for this purpose. These 4 T's are the cornerstones of the WCO's measures in support for enhanced economic competitiveness and effectiveness. Fortunately, the AfCFTA incorporates many of WCO standards. It also provides political will to improve border procedures with more attention and investment in customs. I believe that regulation as a stimulus initiative will raise awareness of the African leaders and create momentum for its implementation, the implementation of African Free Trade Area. The WCO is ready to support the AfCFTA in close collaboration with the stakeholders, including the RaaS initiative that was presented today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for those remarks. Very helpful to put it in a global context. And I'm really pleased that you mentioned the issue of how initiatives like this are likely to enhance domestic resource mobilization, because that's a very important part of what the reform agenda would look like. For our last, but not definitely the least, presenter, we're really happy to have with us today Mr. Peter Mulroy, who is Secretary General of FCI, the world's largest network of factoring companies. Looking forward to hearing your perspectives, Mr. Mulroy. You have the floor.
Thank you, Raymond. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I appreciate just having a few minutes just to have this opportunity. I have to say, I've been really impressed with the initiatives that all of you are embarking on, and I truly appreciate Joy's presentation because it gave me a really good insight into what really this whole RaaS initiative is all about. You know, from my perspective, I come from the finance world. Like I think it was, well, Joy mentioned it. I know the gentleman from the Development Bank mentioned it as well. You know, the importance of liquidity, the importance of the ability to finance SMEs is so paramount. And I believe I was asked to come and speak to you today because the organization that I represent, FCI, is the global association for the factoring and receivables finance industry. And really, at the end of the day, what is it? It's an industry that probably is the biggest contributor of working capital financing to SMEs through the assignment of accounts receivable. And I always call these receivables as the lost ark, basically these dormant assets that sit on sellers throughout the continent, their balance sheets, and lay dormant and have no value. And the whole concept of receivables finance and factoring is to provide value, provide liquidity and cash to these SMEs, and the product factoring does that through very strict controls, through the purchase of accounts receivable and the management of invoices and the underwriting and protection of the payment by the buyer, the ultimate customer of the seller. So so that's why I'm here. And you know, it's interesting because my organization was started in 1968, and our founding member is from South Africa, Nedbank. They were the first to join FCI over 50 years ago. But truthfully, factoring has been ring-fenced predominantly in South Africa. Yes, we've seen great developments of factoring in Northern Africa and places like Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia, also in the Indian Ocean, Mauritius, and some other places, but it's still in its real nascent stage. And of the 54 countries that exist today in the continent, the vast majority of them do not have the proper regulations, the proper laws in place to affect the transfer of that dormant receivable sitting on that SME's balance sheet to a factor, to a bank, to a financial institution, for them to provide this concept called factoring to that seller and get them the cash they need to buy products and continue to trade. And with the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, I think this has only accelerated the necessity of the deployment of factoring and receivables finance in Africa. This is not something we just started. I mean, FCI has been making visits and trips to Africa, doing a sensitization training and everything over for a number of decades. But really, things took off in earnest in 2000 and let's say 14, when we really started working very closely with the African Export-Import Bank, and they are now our firm partner. We have numerous projects in place with them. They represent FCI, the factoring committee for Africa. They chair it and they run it, and Dr. Rama is on our board of directors. Basically, so I talked about the issues, the problems. There are limited laws, limited regulations. Activity is very small. The total market is around 26 billion in euros terms. The whole industry is around over 3 trillion. Just to give you an idea, it's less than 1% in Africa, in all of Africa. So the volume perspective is very small. The other thing that we look at is how much does factoring penetrate markets? And the average, for example, in Europe is 10%. So if you look at today, I think it's approximately the whole industry and its various components in receivables finance is around 5 trillion, around $5 trillion. And that's 6% of global GDP. So, and if you take that 10% barometer, well, the GDP of Africa is 2.6 trillion. So 10% of that is 260 billion. Yet we are only at 26 billion, 1/10 of that. So to get to that 10% GDP figure, there's a lot to do. If we do nothing, we'll trug along. We'll go from 26 billion, I think, to around 50 billion by 2030. But to get to 100 billion, to that bigger figure, it's going to require, this movement and the support from you all, relating to promotion of proper laws and regulations relating to the permission, the allowance of doing factoring in the markets. And why is that important? Because an investor, a bank, a non-bank, an entrepreneur is not going to put their money into the hands of an SME, and knowing that SMEs have a much higher default rate without knowing that these controls are in place, that these important controls are in place to distribute capital in these markets. So this is why it's so important. Now, in terms of initiatives, we have a large initiative with the BCEAO in West Africa right now to launch factoring. The Afro-Exim Bank has developed a model law on factoring, and we're using that to deploy this model law in numerous countries. We've had meetings with the African Parliament to basically spread and complete the understanding of what this means to their economy to help SMEs. We have a very large project in Nigeria occurring. The Parliament has the Senate has already approved the new model law, the legislation. So there is an act that's going through Congress now, and we anticipate it will be completed by next year. We've had successful completion of the law and regulations in places like Egypt. In Morocco, there's kind of a quasi regulation. So the point is, it's coming, it's happening, but there's much more we can do. I want to just say 2 last things. One, the African Development Bank basically granted the industry a nearly $500,000 grant just to help with the promotion and technical assistance of the growth of factoring in Africa. And the Afro-Exim Bank, as I mentioned, has done numerous projects to help support the growth and sensitization training. We just deployed a new person in Africa who's based in Cameroon. So a lot happening. I could go on and on. I don't want to bore you all, but the point is, we're just on the tip of the iceberg. But to the point of this concept of moving regulations and using regulations as a tool to increase liquidity, capital, and trade, I think it's a phenomenal initiative. And this is something that please keep factoring at the top of your radar screen to support this growth. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mulroy, and thanks to all of our esteemed speakers and panelists. We've definitely learned so much from this interaction. I think the most important thing is that the call to action has gone out. We do understand that when we're thinking about stimuli to kickstart sustainable development in Africa, it's not just on the financial side or ODA. There's a lot that can be done on the regulatory side that could deliver results that not only bolster growth and trade, but also deliver development on the ground to the households and the businesses, both small and large, that would fuel this in the future. So thank you so much once again. Do apologize again for running over, but I'd like to give the last word to our boss, Ms. Ahuna Eziakonwa, who's already been introduced. You have the floor.
Raymond, thank you very much for a brilliant moderation of our last couple of hours on this topic. Ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, I think we've seen some truly compelling data and promising shifts as well. The public is demanding a change, enabling environments, a culture of governance that ensures that Africa's money, Africa's resources works for Africa's development. And Africa may not have at this point trillions of dollars of free money to rescue businesses that have been crippled by COVID-19. But this conversation has shown us that it is possible to put money directly into the hands of Africa's businesses, small, medium enterprises, by unlocking regulatory bottlenecks that can increase business efficiencies for these businesses. And this will work as a de facto stimulus, keeping money in the hands of enterprise while also increasing revenue for governments. This is why we're engaging in this. It's a win-win situation. It's good development policy and practice. And it also has this potential to promote not only job creation, but value-added industrialization. And the result of this is that we see a possibility of denting poverty in a crisis, but also inequality, reducing inequality. Inclusion of women, as we factor that in, gives huge gains as sectors in which they trade most will definitely be enhanced. So we're energized, and the political will that accompanies the AfCFTA can be extended to this very model as well. And we're grateful for the outstanding show of support from continental trade leaders, but also institutions. And we will continue, of course, to work with you, Your Excellencies, as we take the regulations as a stimulus model on a roadshow to heads of states across Africa, because that's what it's going to take. We will work with you to convene high-level dialogues along the sidelines of the African Union summits, to raise more awareness, sensitize, and join more leaders to support regulation as stimulus, and bring private sector into the room as well to have this engagement. Ladies and gentlemen, it's not just about the piece of paper of the regulation. It then needs to be practicalized and actually implemented, because many of these exist already, but they're not being implemented as well. So we have two problems: the absence, in some cases, of regulatory frameworks that promote trade facilitation, but also where they exist, the lack of implementation. So as I close, let me thank our co-organizers, Africa Investor and AfCFTA Secretariat, for your thought leadership on this issue. You both embody exceptional leadership in birthing and acting on new solutions for Africa. And let me also thank our outstanding panelists for your solutions leaning and very rich insights and support. Thank you to our lively audience as well. The journey is just beginning, but we're all in it together. Thank you all. Back to you, Raymond.
Thank you so much for those excellent closing remarks. Nothing more to add, but just to add my voice to yours in thanking everyone who joined us, and thanks to the audience. And also thank you so much to Woifan Ibrahim, Vice Executive Secretary of the Mahamadou Issoufou Foundation, who has stayed with us. Do extend our thanks to His Excellency as well. This is a journey, that we started, and we will continue with your continued support. Thank you very much, and goodbye.